Thanks for tuning in to Becoming Something, where we promise to keep the conversation honest and real for young adults in their 20s and 30s. Every moment we live is training for a future moment, and that's why we do this podcast, because we want you to be prepared for everything that life is going to throw at you. Our hope with this podcast is that it would help you become all that God desires you to be. So with that in mind, let's jump right in to this week's episode of Becoming Something.
What's up, podcast world? It's your boy JP in the podcast studio with Nathan Hilgenkamp. Nathan H.C. Hilgenkamp.
Okay, for these next 30 minutes, I'd like to spend this time talking to you guys about...
And Kathy Davidson.
Okay, hello.
Kathy's here also.
Gosh, Nate, you always do that to me.
What did he do to you?
He just always just starts talking and just tries to not remind people that I'm on this podcast.
I feel like he's not for you.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk about
I'm going to be completely honest. I'm for me. And whatever gets in the way of this guy.
I'm so thankful that for once you are completely honest.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you for being completely honest.
No problem. That's what I'm here for, guys. Yeah.
Okay, so just under that banner of honesty, let's ask you a couple questions. You can't lie, right? So liar, Jim Carrey, liar.
I've never lied.
Okay, so you can't lie. So do you have good style?
Yes. Well, it just depends on... It depends on the definition of good and style.
Okay. Are you handsome?
Yes.
Are you athletic?
Depends on what stage of my life you're talking about.
Are you smart?
Yeah.
Are you funny?
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Okay.
Are you cool?
Yes.
What are you not good at?
Like sin.
You're not a good sinner.
I'm not.
You're really
good
bad at sinning. Does that mean you're perfect?
And like events and stuff.
Well, that's for sure true.
Yeah, like ordering popcorn and stuff.
Bible knowledge.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Is that all I do in our job?
Asking about 1st and 2nd Kings, I don't know a whole lot about it.
What do you know about 3rd Kings? Favorite verse in 3rd Kings?
Yeah,
I love
like chapter.
We 3 kings have traveled so far.
What about 4th John?
Is that the whole Leonardo da Vinci, like he was the 4th John was maybe in the painting or something?
The Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. You passed that test. You are smart.
You really do know so much.
Thank you guys. So appreciate that. Yeah. I feel loved. So what are we doing today? You said I didn't need a topic, so I don't have a topic today.
Yeah.
I slept in and
So today, we did a podcast on deconstruction. And in that podcast, there was a post that was shared on a Instagram feed, and it was shared in my opinion, it was shared out of context and confusing. So I reached out to the guy who posted and just said, "Hey, would you take it down?" And he said, "Hey, I'd be willing to take it down if we can have a conversation." I said, "Great, absolutely." And so that's where we'll go today. So that's what's going to happen.
So this is kind of surprising. I feel like people don't really do this.
Yeah.
Like someone who
unprecedented. Yeah. You might say.
Yeah. Well, I know we've never done this before. Typically, we're talking to buddies, and not saying this guy's not a buddy. I don't know him.
My concern is people are going to think, hey, the reason here's how we can get on the BSO podcast. We can come after them.
Yeah.
But so that's not the case. We're not going to do that. But in this case, I thought it would be a helpful conversation. So. Yeah,
because that podcast sparked a lot of conversation. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have been talking about it.
Yeah, deconstruction's a hot topic right now.
So I think that there's a lot of people. Well, there's a group of people who are going to be like, I don't see what the big deal is, and I think there's also another portion of Christianity where it's a super hot topic.
Right.
Let's go. Well, let's. With that said, let's bring on Tim. We good?
Hi.
Hey, Tim. How are you,
Hi.
man?
Hi, friends. It's good to meet all of you.
Good to see you, brother. You're in New Jersey?
I am, right by Philadelphia.
Awesome, man. So we are in Waco, Texas. And
oh, okay.
Just
I have friends out there.
Landscape of your life, married, single, kids.
Yeah, married with a 20-month-old and another one due in 2 weeks.
Let's go. Your life is about to change.
Do this work full time. I also play music professionally on the weekends. So
come on,
I keep pretty busy.
You're about to go from zone to man, or actually going to man, I guess. in parenting.
Exactly.
That's
so we're getting ready
jump.
for that and just prepping for all that, the stuff that comes along with that process. So that's kind of what's going on.
Love that. So Kathy Davidson, Nathan or Nate Hilgenkamp, JP, been married 17 years, have 3 kids of my own, 9, 13, and one about to be 15 next week. And so, so just the background on this is we did a podcast on deconstruction, Becoming Something podcast on deconstruction. Tim runs a Instagram account, New Evangelicals, which I think is a brilliant name, by the way, because I feel like there's other names you could have chosen that have baggage attached to them, but that's interesting. I'm like, oh, okay, New Evangelicals. I'm intrigued by that. And that, so talking about deconstruction specifically, we talked about how to deal with hurts in the church. And he picked up the clip and showed that clip, came on behind it, added commentary, and I reached out to him and I just said, hey, that's not what I was trying to say. That's not what I intended to say. I'd love for you to take that down. And you responded graciously and just said, absolutely, I'll take that down, in assuming we can have a conversation about it. And I said, that's always what I'm after, is the conversation. Like my heart is to push people in the church together. And in fact, that's what I was trying to say in that clip, is like, hey, if someone hurt you, talk to the person who hurt you. And we're going to jump in the deep end here, but I'll say this. What I was not intending to say is, hey, forgive and forget and don't hold them accountable to their actions. What I was trying to say, Tim, is I feel like, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, that sometimes we hide behind this, the institution hurt me. Like this institution, and the institution has a name. It's like, it's like if AT&T hurt me, and I would be like, well, AT&T didn't hurt me. It was an employee at AT&T, or maybe even it was a group of people within that organization. But if I say, hey, it's the company, it's like it allows me not to actually deal with my hurt. But if I can say, no, it was this person, then I can deal with the hurt and I can hold them accountable in the midst of that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I do want to say from the outset that for your listeners, just so I'm clear on my end, I am a committed Jesus follower. So I know when people hear things like deconstruction or even quote unquote progressive Christianity, I still don't know what that even is, honestly, to the full extent. But I'm a devoted follower of Jesus. I take my faith seriously. So everything I say is out of that perspective. It's not because I'm just, hurt or I'm upset or I'm an atheist or whatever. I take that seriously. To your point, I think that when it comes to, in this case, church hurt, it's what does that person represent? I mean, pastors represent the institution that they lead. There's no way around that. And pastors have the final say ultimately in who could be a part of that church ultimately. And in this particular case, I can actually draw from my own experience, because this actually happened to me for the first time in my life about a year ago, where my church that I was faithfully involved with when I started this account shortly afterwards said, listen, you have to either stop doing what you're doing on social media or stop serving with us for 6 years. Now, the pastor ultimately is the one who has the authority to put me in that position to make a choice between serving at the church institution, right, or doing what I was doing on social media. I chose to stay with social media. It wasn't a choice I wanted to make. I didn't have any choice to say, actually, I'd rather do yes and yes, both and. So my issue is that in part of the video, when you mention pastors, it's like, well, ultimately that pastor, even though I feel wronged, and there's a lot more to that story that isn't worth, diving in here, but ultimately that person is still doing what they're doing, but I'm no longer allowed to do what I wanted to do at that church. Right. And so even though I've tried to reconcile, the idea of just moving on still carries a lot of pain, because I was attached there for 6 years, all in, fully involved, drumming every Sunday, leading other things. And that was taken away from me when I had no choice in the matter ultimately. Yeah. So yes, obviously an individual or individuals made that decision, but they represent the institution. They get paid to represent being someone who oversees, who shepherds that church. So they have the final authority, whether I agree or not. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I don't know how how deep you want to dive into that specific situation. I do think, as we're talking about church hurt, specificity is our friend. And so I'll ask you questions, and if we need to move more toward hypothetical, we can. But would you say that pastor sinned against you?
Okay, that's a great question. And I'll be honest, I'm very open about this. It's all public anyway. I've done a podcast on this, so I'm not afraid of that. And we're one of our core values as new evangelicals is not dehumanizing people, even ones that we strongly disagree with. So, I'm not here to dehumanize my senior pastor at the time. What I would say is one of the reasons that I was even brought into the office was because he said that other people were talking about stuff I was saying and having a problem with it. They were not addressing me. And I brought that up. I said, well, if we're going to be quote unquote biblical here, right, we're going to go to Matthew and see how the order kind of goes. Why is no one coming to me about this? If they're offended, why are you coming to me? And he agreed. He said, well, I agree. But again, what was the consequence aimed at? Me. It wasn't those people who weren't coming to me. It wasn't even, I believe personally that the situation was mishandled greatly. But again, my options ultimately are, well, if the pastor doesn't see it my way, I still have to leave that institution. Right. And so that was kind of my concern, was like, where's the accountability, right, for when pastors make decisions that hurt people? And the answer we see in sound bites, to be fair, but you guys posted the clip, right, is, hey, if your pastor hurt you and you did all you can, you should just, do your best not to be bitter and move on. I didn't want to move on. I loved that church. I didn't want to leave that place. But again, it sounds like it's on me to try and heal and feel better, while the pastor really keeps going with no accountability. And this is a pattern we see even in the greater evangelical institution time and time again, where pastors, and I want to be clear again, I want to make sure I'm clear about the audience. I actually run a group for pastors who are deconstructing. Okay. I love pastors. Pastors don't have it easy. I'm not saying you guys have an easy job. I know there's a lot of stuff that comes with it, but there are certainly pastors who abuse their position or do things like this, and there's no accountability for them. And that's the question that a lot of us are asking, is what will it take for accountability to happen?
Yeah. And so I just want to insert, and I know you heard me earlier, is, hey, I don't think, what I'm not saying is you have no course of action. There's nothing that I'm trying to imply that is somebody who is hurt by anyone, be it a pastor, a member of the church, or a group of people within an organization, that they should just forgive and forget. And candidly, you can't forget. And I've said that many times, absent of a lobotomy, like we cannot willfully forget something. And so it's not a biblical idea to forgive and forget. There are courses of action, that the scriptures give us, that do hold someone accountable within their sin, right? And so I guess I would ask you, in that specific situation, well, I want to go back to that question before we move past it. You would say, I think, based on your answer, that individual did sin against you.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to avoid the question. I think it would have to define, like, what do we mean by sin? Like, I think that's a very low determinant of itself. Did the pastor mishandle the situation? Do I feel like I didn't get a fair shake? Do I feel like my time and energy and, even finances that I invested there ultimately came back with, hey, you don't believe exactly how we believe, so you have to go? Yes. If that counts as sin, then I was sinned against. Was I manipulated and abused, like some of the stories that we get? No. Okay. I'm going to be clear about that. I wasn't being screamed at or yelled at or, told all kinds of dehumanizing things. So in that sense, no, I wasn't sinned against.
And so what would you have liked to have seen happen, or even now? And maybe that's what God's doing here. Maybe he's going to do whatever it is that should be done. What do you want to happen?
Well, as far as my situation specifically with that church, it just is what it is. I've just had to, I do agree with you that bitterness can really rot someone's heart. And there's a difference between, I think, even anger and bitterness, right? Like me going through the phases of anger and just feeling, especially being a type 6 on the Enneagram. I'm not sure if you guys talk about that at all, but I'm a loyalist. Relationships are core to who I am. They supersede beliefs for me.
That satanic occult.
So for me, it's like, am I losing you here?
No, I was kidding. I made an Enneagram joke and it just didn't.
Love the
I couldn't hear it. I'm sorry.
We love Enneagram 6s, so way to go.
You're good.
Okay.
Keep going.
All right. Well, so the point of that is to say that for me, I can work with people who don't see things the way I do on a lot of issues. I love that. I think that that's what makes the body of Christ beautiful, is that there is unity in diversity. So what was the most hurtful to me was being told, hey, you don't see some of the stuff the way that we do. People are getting offended at what you're saying. And despite everything that you've given here relationally, it's no good because your beliefs are secondary. I'm sorry, our belief system is primary to our relationship with you. So I had to go through the process of hurt and betrayal and feeling that way. But I also had to realize that bitterness, is when things can get real negative. There's a difference again between anger and bitterness. So for me, I don't really have much I would say about that situation. If they reached out to me to apologize, I would love to have it. But knowing who I am, I can't be the person begging and pleading, can we please talk? Like, it wasn't my call. I had to accept it and just kind of move on and let it go on, even though I didn't want any of that to go down the way that it did. Does that make sense?
I don't know. And I want to be clear. I really am sincerely. My heart is not in any way to be combative. I'm asking to seek to understand, because I'm concerned that people could hear that as though you're saying, "Hey, you just need to move on. Like, don't be bitter. You can't really do anything." And you said, "And I just had to move on," which I think was the issue that you took with what it seemed as though I was saying. And so I'm asking, what is it you would like to happen?
Now or then in the moment? I mean,
both.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
like which part?
Either one, either then or now.
Sure. Well, I think then I would have really loved those people who were talking about me behind my back to just talk to me. I've been there for 6 years, fully invested.
I think that's super fair. And so the anybody who's listening to this, I would say, if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, everybody's talking," I hate those phrases because the people will hide behind, well, everybody or all of the office and everyone, and I always go, who? And I grab a pen and pad and I just go, who's talking? I want to make sure that I talk with them because I want to be diligent at preserving the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace, Ephesians 4:3. And if someone is saying something about me behind my back, that in and of itself is sin. I need to, you brought up Matthew, I need to go to them and tell them. And so who is saying something? And so I completely affirm and validate your frustration with that. That is not right. In my humble opinion, having not been there, he should not have said, "Hey, all these people are talking to you," without saying, "Here specifically who has said something." So, and beyond that, what would you have wanted to see happen?
Well, I think if, again, we're talking about hypotheticals, right? But it would have been good to have the people who I was close to in leadership, at least advocate for a plurality of perspectives, on some of these issues that people were having a problem with, because the Christian tradition is much bigger than any of the streams that we swim in. It just is. So that would have been great to have, ultimately. But, it, like I said, it didn't go down that way. So for me, I was comfortable there. I was cool having people who were, some of them legitimate QAnon supporters. I was like, well, I got to deal with this. I'm not going to tell them that they can't be here, right? I got to work through this. Yeah. That's my perspective, but it wasn't, reciprocated because in their minds I was too, maybe progressive is the right word. I'm not sure, but they just didn't like how I was talking about certain issues.
Yeah. And so what do you, and so that's interesting. Like, I'd love your advice, counsel, perspective on, if I lead a church and I subscribe to a doctrine, and so Coley, it's like super echoey. I'm fine with it. It's not bothering me as long as it's okay and it's going to sound okay to others. But okay, so I lead a church. I subscribe to a doctrine. Like I read the Bible in a way, and I'm leading people that direction. And someone comes and they have a perspective that is different than what I understand the scriptures to teach. And I'm just like, hey, I believe that's wrong. I have the freedom to believe that's wrong. And as I lead an organization, I have the freedom to shepherd this organization in a way to highlight that being wrong. How is that okay? Or is that going to create hurt within that person? Does that make sense? Like if someone says, and we can go with a specific, but it's just like, hey, I believe that we should gather on Sunday for church, and they say, hey, you know what? I really subscribe to the original Sabbath being Saturday. It shouldn't have changed. We're going to gather on Saturday. You can do your deal on Sunday, but we're going to hold youth group on Saturday. And I'm like, man, I really would prefer you not to do that. I don't believe that's right. Here's why. and I'm making this, I'm kind of trying to come up with a ridiculous one. Like, can I do that? Like, is that okay? Is there a way for me to do that in a way that doesn't create hurt for that person, and we can agree to part ways? And I say, hey, I no longer want you working here because you seem to insist on taking people a direction that I don't want the church to go.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And this is a very situational situation, right? Depends on what we're talking about. But in this case, if a church has clear, policies and procedures, and hey, it's very clear this is how we do things. And if you get hired or if you volunteer here, you're acknowledging that this is how we do things and you're comfortable with that, right? And someone goes, actually, no, like I disagree with this thing in the handbook. I'm making up an example, right? And no, I'm going to plant my flag that my youth group should be meeting Saturday nights. It's more biblical. Yeah. I totally get how a pastor can say, listen, I hear you. And I'm not even saying that you can't do that, but as a church institution, we've already kind of decided this as a corporate body, right? That we land here. Can you give on this part, right? That's one thing. But let's take another example, like hell, for example. Let's take something a little more theologically, important, right? Right. I was brought up and raised in evangelical fundamentalist culture. Hell is an eternal place of conscious torment that you go to. And a lot of pastors in my circles that I know of, they plant their flag. This is the absolute truth. What I think a lot of people in my circles now, as we're learning, is like, actually, in the Christian tradition, there's two other ways of viewing hell that aren't just eternal conscious torment. Now, I'm not asking for my senior pastor to start advocating for universal reconciliation, for example, right? But if I hold that view personally, am I allowed to hold that view and still be a part of your church? Because in the Christian tradition, there are faithful church people historically who've held that position. I'm not asking you to change your view, but can you make space for me just to have that view internally? That's where I think things start getting tense for me, where I'm like, well, who's drawing the lines here? Is it the Christian tradition, which is pretty wide, or is it, no, our church holds these things objectively true, regardless of what other Christians have said. And anyone who holds these beliefs is now a heretic or not a Christian, etc. Does that make sense?
It does. And so let's just go with that one, because that's truer. And so I would say I do hold to what you would call a fundamentalist view of hell, and so a place of eternal torment. And so let's say you do not, you're here, and you would say, hey, is that okay? I would say, yeah, I don't think that is a salvific. Like we have these concentric circles of disagreement, if you will. And so where you're at, I believe that you can hold to that view and still get into heaven, but I would ask that you don't teach that view, because as we're here and I'm held accountable to what people are learning, would you be willing to not teach that view? And then so would you say, well, that's not right? Like if I'm there, I should be free to hold to my convictions and teach them. Because what I would say is, what I want for you, I'd be like, hey, Tim, I don't want to say anything insincere in the hypothetical, right? But I would say, I love you. Right. I love you as a brother in Christ. I desire God's best for you. You seem to, you're well studied. You've looked at this. You've seen the options, annihilationism, the universal, all of these ideas that you understand better than candidly most people. Why wouldn't you want to go to a church that holds and teaches to that and gives you the freedom to teach that freely? Like that's what I would do. You have that freedom, and I'm not in a hurry to get you there. It's not like, hey, your door's locked, put your stuff in a box, I'm going to escort you out. It's like, no, man, I care about you, but if you want to teach that, I'm going to ask you not to teach that here. Do you think that's fair?
Well, yeah. If you have a teaching pastor, right, that is on staff, right, and they hold that view, and they're like, I want to teach it, I would have to, and I don't want to tell you how to run your church. That's not my point, but this is all hypothetical, right? Like person A is doing this, what we can say. If I was, for the way I'm wired, okay, just being transparent, I'm all about educating people on how the church historically has seen these topics. I don't think that we should withhold, right, the argument for annihilationism or universal reconciliation from the general populace of evangelicalism. They should know how people have seen these things. Now, that doesn't mean that someone can't land and say, you know what, after the evidence, though, the church teaches this, but we're aware of these other views. Right. That's different than, hey, keep that to yourself. No one needs to know about that. The only thing that they need to know about is that ECT is the way to go. We're not going to even present, the other ways that, again, I want to be clear, other legitimate Christian early church fathers and so on have held to. I think that's the difference for me, right? It's like, what's the motive? Are we trying to educate people and trying to kind of give them a tour through some of the greater circles that we're swimming in theologically? Or are we just trying to tell them, here's the objective truth, it's what we think it is, no Christians have ever seen it any differently, and here you go? That's the difference for me.
There's a great story about that when Francis Chan and I think it was Preston Sprinkle were writing Erasing Hell. They tripped over there's some evidence here, and then they began that dialogue. I would say it's going to be difficult as that plays out for you, if I won't say you, the person, for the person to be guilty of what they're not wanting to do, which is to begin to press their agenda. So it's not just here's the options. Traditionally, here's what the church has historically held as perspectives on hell, and not to say, oh, and by the way, I think this one's right. I think they're onto something here. And therein lies the challenge, because where you can create division and confusion.
Can I respond to that quickly?
Sure,
do you mind?
Of course.
Just for fun. I want to say I'm very much enjoying the conversation. I personally am like a friendly debater type, so I like when ideas are kind of, having some friction. I actually interviewed Preston Sprinkle recently, and he's pretty much blatantly an annihilationist now. He's switched from his view of Erasing Hell on. Right. But one of the things I would say is, and I want to be clear, I'll use my experience as just growing up, and I tell people this a lot. And I think a lot of people in our community for new evangelicals, what we're not saying is that, you have to switch from the fundamentalism you grew up with to now our new fundamentalism that now has new objective truths that are totally true in every regard. Instead, it's saying, I just hold some of these, what I was taught as absolutely true doctrines, a little bit looser, because it turns out when you start reading Christian history, there's actually it's hard to land on some of this authoritatively. Now, again, I'm not saying you can't hold the view. I might land right now as an annihilationist, but what I wouldn't say is, anyone who holds the ECT just doesn't know their Bible. Anyone who holds the ECT is clearly not a heretic, or they're just a fundy, a fundamentalist. I would acknowledge that there are other ways to see it. That's different than how a lot of people that I'm working with grew up, which was, there's no other way to see it. This is the only way to see it. Anyone else who has seen it this way is not really a Christian. That would be the difference that I'm talking about.
I understand that and agree with you. I mean, I think we are more similar than we are different in that.
No surprise. That's how it always goes in person,
Right. And I would say respectfully, I know you said, hey, new evangelicals, we don't want to do this. And I think based on this conversation with you that's true. I think there are a lot of people that are sitting in their hurt, not moving forward in their hurt, that are not rebuilding. They're not holding their hands open. They're not wanting to create space for healthy disagreement. They just want to express their hurt and really to lash out and that's what I was trying to say is man, we've got to create safe spaces. That's a loaded term right now, for the conversations between people. That's what I see the call of Scripture repeatedly is, we are ambassadors, we are ministers of reconciliation. We're called to put the pieces back together and not to sit and stew in the bitterness, in the hurt, and not do anything about it.
Yeah, my question to you is, what's that timeline look like?
Yeah,
I mean, put it like this, right? In our DMs, we got about 10,000 DMs last year in 2021 on our Instagram account from people all over the place, different stories. A very common one I've heard, specifically from the queer community, was, hey, when I was 13, I came out to my youth pastor and he called me an abomination and told me never to come back. Now, at what point do you tell that person, hey, you have to get over it? I mean, what point? 3 years in, 4 years in, 5 years in, especially when maybe there was no communication after that. And that's my concern is I hear what you're saying. I do.
But
and
I
think that healing is a thing. But like, who sets these time limits on, hey, you have to start rebuilding right now? It's like, well, I've been in these circles for 30 years. I'm like 2 years post evangelicalism. Can I have time to process what the heck just happened to me as I sort through the emotional, the theological, the relational, the systems that I've experienced of that form my belief system before someone tells me, hey, you're not building something new fast enough. And so that's a problem.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I want to answer. That's a fair question. It deserves an answer. So it's like if, here's what I'd liken it to. Trauma, hurt, it's like you fall in a pit. And so I've fallen in a hole, and the world, like the world did this to me, or someone did this to me, and I don't want to deal with that. I really just want to stay in this hole. And so I'm going to stay down here. And there's two responses that I would say are wrong. One response is what I think you're addressing, is when someone comes and they stand over the hole and they say, get out of there. What are you doing? Hey, you can't stay in there. I'm going to drop the rope and I'm going to pull. No, come, get out. You cannot be in there. No, hurry. Hey, listen, in 5 minutes, you better be out of that hole. That's a wrong response. There's another wrong response. The other wrong response is, oh man, you're in a hole. I'm going to crawl in there with you. And that sounds, you're like, wow, that's compassion. That's the heart of God. I'm going to crawl in there with you, and I'm going to, you know what, this hole that you're in, let's just make a home here. Let's order furniture. Let's make the bed. You know, let's begin to hang up pictures on the wall. You know what? I think we can just stay in this hole. And now that I'm in it with you, it's going to be more. In fact, we'll both just stay in the hole. And the answer to the question is, what's the timeline? Is I would say there is no timeline. It is all about progression. Like, as long as we're moving, we can move 1 centimeter at a time. We can move 1 centimeter a year. We can take baby steps. But I think if those both are both wrong responses, if we can agree on that, I think the right response is, hey, I'm going to crawl in the hole with you. I'm going to put my arm around you, and I'm going to lead with empathy. Man, I hate that guy said that to you. That was wrong. And you're not an abomination, and God's not mad at you, and he doesn't hate you. He loves you. He's crazy about you. He loves you so much. He sent his son Jesus to die for you at a great expense to him. He's expressed his love to you. And I understand that you're hurt, and we're down here at the bottom. But man, we've got to get out, and I want you to take your time, because I know it's crazy up there. It's scary, and there's lots of hurts up there. But I'm gonna put my hand here. And I want you to put your hand here, and we're going to go slow, and just one at a time. I'm going to put my foot, and we're going to climb out, all as you take your time. I'm not in a hurry, but we do need together to get out of here. And I think that's a picture of what it could look like. And I agree with you. At least I think what you're saying, hey, that first response is absolutely wrong. I agree. And then I would just add to it, and I don't know if you would agree, that the second response is also wrong, and there has to be some middle ground taken there.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the language of, even in this case, right or wrong. So I think that implies like a moral, like, is this sinful or not? I would say, is it wise or unwise? Mm-hmm. And I think that perhaps parking, in your hole and building furniture ultimately is not wise. However, one important distinction that I think is key is that who is leading the healing, right? The person who didn't experience it, who's jumping in the hole saying, don't worry, I'm going to fix the problem, just follow my lead, or someone who's saying, as a friend, right, I'm going to just support you as you crawl out of the hole on your time, in your way, as you need to. Because guess what? I'm not the one here who was in this case, the victim of what happened. So I think that would be a small difference. And also, I would also add that, one thing we're not really talking about here is the relationship between you and that person, right? And this is a trap that all of us, including myself, we kind of fall into unintentionally, but social media really cuts off that humanness, right? We're all responding to things. We're all sharing our hot takes. I mean, as you know, I'm guilty of that too. So I understand that. But on a relational level, right? Who are the people in our orbits, right? That we have that equity built up with, that when the time comes, maybe we give the push, but there's equity built that this person knows that we have their best at heart, as opposed to someone through a screen, right? That maybe even unintentionally comes across as, hey man, if you get hurt, you just got to push through it. It's like, well, who is this guy? Again, I'm not saying that's intentional on your part. I'm just saying that's how the optics may look to someone who's in the trench, right? Who doesn't know you and is like, I'll get out when I need to get out. I appreciate you, I guess, thinking about me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I don't want to, I don't want to come across as defensive. But what I would say to you is it really looks that way when you come behind me and I say this, and that's not what I intended, and it's out of context. And then you say, hey, this is really harmful. He's just saying you need to forgive and forget. Well, I never said forgive and forget. That's not even what I'm implying. What I'm actually trying to say is you need to hold the person who hurt you accountable. I totally agree with you on the relationship matters. Like in trying to help someone, we definitely want to consider, like, hey, what is our relationship with them, and are we the right person to help them with where they're at? Like, can we empathize with their pain? I'd love to ask you something else. If you want to respond.
I was just gonna say that, and I want to be clear. I'm totally fine being pressed. It doesn't bother me. I'm not offended by it or anything like that. But the video that is shared on the account, like it's pretty clear, like, that if a pastor hurts you or someone hurts you, you do your best to start the moving on process as soon as you're able to. Like, you shake the dust off your feet. That's kind of the impression I thought was pretty clear. Now, I'll have to rewatch it to be frank, but I just want to point out one last thought about that is that, you mentioned like accountability, but I just want to say, like, I have no power to hold my senior pastor accountable for anything that I think he did wrong to me. That I could go to his house tomorrow and say, you wronged me. And he could say, I disagree. And there would be nothing else. There'd be no church council. He wouldn't be brought before the church to talk about it. It would not happen because I'm going to use the word, the power dynamic is very different. So I think that that's something that we have to be aware of, is that, some people in their positions of authority and leadership over churches do have a difference in how they're held accountable versus, someone like myself who was just a volunteer. That's all.
I'd say that's true in unhealthy circumstances. If you're saying that volunteer doesn't have a course of action, but it does, like the scripture does give us a course of action with an elder, that we can take someone with us and bring an accusation against an elder, and I think that's why elders are so important. That's why I think you have to have other people that pastor, like myself, I have to be subject to someone, and not just one person that I can try to win over and manipulate, but really a multitude of people, a diversity of personality, a diversity of others walking in the Spirit that will hold me accountable to being a servant. And this is another thing that I think we'd agree on. I really think that, like, the age of celebrity pastor, the age of deeming someone with ultimate authority, it's not healthy. And that the pastor is the chief servant. Like, they're the ones that's setting out the chairs. They're the ones that are cleaning the toilets. They're the ones that are visiting people in the hospital. They're the ones that are caring for people. And we've kind of left that behind. But a question I'd love to ask you is, I'm curious if you've come across this, is like, have you ever peeled back the hurt and seen it as not valid? And I know that sounds really harsh, but like, here, I'll give you an example. And again, in hypothetical world, where it's like, somebody comes to you, they come to New Evangelicals, and they're just like, Tim, I've been so hurt by the church. They hurt me repeatedly, systematically. They abused me, and they're using those words, and you're leaning in, and your mind's painting the picture of probably what happened. And you start to ask them, and you say, gosh, what did that, like, I'm so sorry, I want to help you heal in that. What did that look like? And they say, well, you're not going to believe it. I auditioned for the worship team, and I went up there, and they pulled me aside, Tim, in front of everyone, which was 2 people. And they told me that I wasn't good enough. Can you imagine that I'm not good enough to lead people in worship? They said I didn't have what it takes, and they insulted me, and they said, you know what, if you go back and maybe you practice, you can come back and try again. And so I left, and I hired a vocal coach, and I did all the things that they told me to do. And then I went back there, and I tried out again, and again they humiliated me in front of everybody. They told me that I wasn't good enough. And as you start peeling back the layers, like the picture becomes, man, it sounds like you auditioned for the worship team and didn't make it, like has that ever, I'm totally made that scenario up. That's not real, but
is that your experience?
No. Yeah. If it was anybody's experience, it was mine. Yeah. I'm just curious. Are you seeing that?
That's a good question.
One of our core values is that I am radically transparent with everything that we do. Everything is transparent. So if that was the case, I would tell you, like, yeah, I've gotten DMs that way. That's not the DMs that we're getting. That's not the stories that we're getting. Yeah. We're not getting stories about people who were like, hey, they changed the color of carpet to blue. And I expressed my disdain and they said, well, too bad. And I'm hurt. I'm talking about
so you're just saying,
and I'm not
I don't want to move past that. And that's helpful. Like that was a really sincere question. And you're just saying, no, honestly, it's not the victim mentality that has been marked by a generation. It is, as we peel back the layers, and you don't have to go into specifics, I believe you, it is real, sincere hurts from people in churches, real abuse, real trauma, real scenarios. It's not the thing that you just said.
That's right. I mean, I won't give any specifics, but we're talking about legitimate sexual abuse. We're talking about people who are under NDAs where they can't disclose what happened to them. I'm talking about people who were part of large churches that just did some things that just make your jaw drop. That's verifiable in the news. I mean, this is stuff that, these are not people who were like, I'm hurt, I was on the worship team. These people that we're working with and talking to, the story that I shared about my own church hurt is completely tame. Compared to most of the stories that we get, on the daily. And if you want, just so you know, if you go to our Instagram page, we have highlights. So you can look at the different topics that we covered. And the way we do it is people send in their answer. We screenshot it anonymously and share it in our stories, depending on the topic. So you can see people's responses on all kinds of topics, especially purity culture, sex culture in the church, and just all kinds of things. And some of the stories are just, it's up to you to believe them or not. We obviously believe them. That's the stance that we take. They will make your jaw drop, some of them.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, man. Well, I appreciate, again, just your gracious response to my request and for coming on here and having the conversation. Any questions for us or for these guys? You guys have been kind to sit there and be like the armor bearers or whatever.
It's always good to hear, I'm sure I know you're familiar with the term deconstruction. I think in one of the other reels, you kind of made it, your view of it seemed to be like, potentially parts of deconstruction, I don't want to mischaracterize what you're saying, is that, we're just trying to demo the house and never rebuild kind of thing. So I would always like to have your perspectives on what you think about deconstruction from the outside looking in.
Yeah. So that this would be a grievance that I take with you respectfully. So I wouldn't say that. Like I wouldn't say, you said we're just trying, those are broad brush statements. We're just trying to demo the house and not rebuild. I would say there are people who in deconstruction stay there. So deconstruction is a huge part of my story, an enormous part of my story. So I grew up in the church. I went to a parochial school for 9 years, and I got to this. I went to college, and I came to this place, this crisis of the faith, where I was like, man, what do I really believe? And I had all of these. I mean, I was involved in a Catholic church, a Lutheran church, and a Baptist church, and then a non-denominational church. And so I had all of these expressions of churches, and in each of them, broken expressions of churches. And I came to this place that was like, what do I hold on to? Like, how do I know what's true? And I had to begin to deconstruct. And we didn't call it then. This was 20 years ago, and so I didn't. That word wasn't in my vocabulary in that way. But as I look back, Tim, that's exactly what I did was deconstruct. And so what I would advise somebody is it's exactly kind of go back to my whole scenario, if you will. It's like, man, you are fine to erase the whiteboard, and then begin to ask the question, what's true? What I don't think is healthy, and I think you agree based on the limited, clips I've seen, is when someone just stays in, in the illustration I used is in demo mode. Like they just, hey, I want to stay in, tear the house down mode. I don't want to rebuild. The institution's corrupt. No one's right. There is no truth. There's your truth and their truth, and there is no truth, and we can't know. And so I'm just going to stay in demo mode. And that's where they do that thing that you said they can't do, is just grow bitter. And then the bitterness overwhelms them. And so, like, man, I don't think like deconstruction's not real. I'm always like, hey, what do you mean by that? When someone says it, because I want, different people will define it in different ways. And then I would say, as someone said, I think on a comment of that video as it was up, it was like, hey, he needs to talk to somebody who's gone through it. I was like, man, I have gone through it. That is an enormous part of my story, is deconstruction. And the rebuilding and trying to understand, okay, what is true? And it has led me to this place, like you said, of like, all right, man, here's what I believe to be true. Like, here's strong convictions. The tomb is empty, like Christ crucified, he resurrected. And then there's a lot of other things that I hold with an open hand. Hey, I believe this is what it means, but I know people much smarter than me believe it means that, and I respect that. And they are brothers and sisters in Christ. So that's how I would say.
Can you, just so I understand it, I don't mind you pushing me back at all, but can you explain how I mischaracterized what you just said? Because I thought I was pretty fair when I said that you think that some people in deconstruction are staying in demo day, or just trying to demo things and not rebuild anything. So did I mischaracterize what you said in your reel?
Yeah, thank you. You said just now, you said some people in deconstruction are staying in demo day. And the first time you said, what you're saying about us in deconstruction is that we just stay in demo day. And so those two statements, I think the big word, I don't mean to nitpick, is just that word some. I'm saying there are people in deconstruction who don't want to rebuild. And if you said, hey, if you came behind me and said, see what he just said? He said that everyone in deconstruction just stays in demo day. I'd say, whoa, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. That's not what I'm saying. He's saying that we just need to forgive and forget and move on. I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying you will need to forgive. You won't forget. And you do need to hold anybody who hurt you accountable to their action. I'm saying all of those things. And so if somebody came behind me and just said, hey, he's saying that that we're just supposed to forgive and forget, I'm like, oh gosh, that's not at all what I meant. You do need to forgive. That's true. I don't want you to grow bitter. That's true. And you do need to hold someone responsible for their actions. That's also true. And so all of those things can be true.
Okay, I understand. That makes sense. What are your thoughts on the separation between the actual church, like the gathering of the church, versus the evangelical institutions that we map onto the church? What is flexible? What can come and go? And what will stay forever, essentially, for you?
The evangelical institutions that we map onto the church. What do you mean? Can you give me an example?
Yeah. So for example, right, let's just take the average, and I don't know, just so you guys know, I don't know much about any of your churches or what kind of church you have, but let's take the average mega church, right? It's pretty corporate model. There's a top down model. Usually you're in PCO, you have all your volunteers, you have all your structures that make things work, etc. Right? I would not argue that that's the church. Those are institutions that we've mapped onto how the church organizes in 2022 in America context, right? Because the church hasn't always organized that way. So my question to you is, for you, what is the actual church that will, be preserved forever, right? Because I believe that the church will go on forever and that's the hope of the world, versus the systems that in our cultural moment are mapped onto how the church organizes. And then out of those, what are flexible for you? Meaning they can really come and go and the church will still keep going forward.
Yeah. I'm going to answer and tell me if I missed the mark. I think I understand. When I interviewed for this job, so I've been here 3 years, I just said to the elders, I said, what are your sacred cows? And I'm not picking on them, they just responded like, hey, I don't think we have any. And I said, great. So if I want to worship on Saturday, are you guys good with that? And they're like, no, we kind of like church on Sunday. I said, great. So day of week, that's a sacred cow. And I said, any others? And they said, no. And I said, okay, well, if I want to do away with music, like if I'm just like, hey, I'm not for music, are you guys okay with that? And they were like, no, we want to, we want to sing and music and that. And and I said, great. So that's a sacred cow. Now you understand what I'm saying. What's important to you? And because I don't want to come here as your leader and just say, hey, my only real sacred cow is kind of what we see in Acts 2, is the assembly of people devoted to the teaching of God's word and then being the hands and feet of Christ in a community, the local expression of the body. Like if it is really that loose and we don't gather, we don't gather, weekly, or we don't gather at a certain time, I just don't want to surprise you. And so, like, in this interview process, before I pull my kids away from their best friends, before we sell our home, before we change schools and move into a new community, it's going to be really important to me that we define church the same way. And in that conversation, I think we did get down to how you define it, which I think the Bible defines as the ecclesia, which is the assembly of God's people. How that happens, there's lots of freedom, and we can talk about the specificity of communion and baptism and marriage and those things that happen within the church that I think are important and have always been a part of the church. But I agree, when we say church, I'm not talking about a building, and I'm also not talking about a specific time and place of a gathering. I'm talking about the bride of Jesus, God's people, which again, I don't want to belabor this point, but was what I was saying in that other clip. Is I said, hey, the church has not hurt you. The bride of Jesus has not hurt you. It was a person claiming membership of a church or people. And so I would name those people that hurt you so the people that you name can be held accountable, which was the point of that podcast.
I only ask because something that I found a lot of in the circles that I'm running in and the people that I engage with who don't see things, the same way I do, is kind of going back to your analogy that you used in that video. And if I'm not intentionally trying to mischaracterize the video, I'm sure I'm very clear. I think you hinted that some people, right, are just taking a sledgehammer and that they don't want to rebuild anything. Is that kind of the idea?
Yes,
right. Some people,
right.
Not all.
Some people remain angry, and it doesn't seem to me in my conversations with them, specifically people I've talked to, they have no interest in, hey, I never want to be a part of a church again. I don't want anything to do with that. I just want to tear it down.
Okay, gotcha. What I have also found is that a lot of because we get this critique a lot, what are you trying to do to make the church better, to build it up? And I think it's a fair critique. The reality, though, is that I found people don't like our answers, which is that, in my view, mega church needs to go. Like these institutions that we've built that, again, I'm going to be very blunt and honest with you from my perspective, that really have created systems that allow men to seriously abuse and get away with it. I mean, I'm going to say the name. Mark Driscoll's a great example of this. I mean, a great example of this. The man has an entire podcast named after him, essentially detailing his abuse, and he's still a lead pastor and welcomed by other large mega churches, to teach. And so the issue for me, to be clear to the audience, is that I believe that the church is the hope of the world. I think that the gathering of people in community, loving God, loving people, celebrating Eucharist, the preaching of the word, and study of it is essential. What is not essential to me anymore are these massive systems that we've created, these multi-million-dollar systems that essentially, in my view, are event focused, right? The Sunday morning event is the center of what we do. And then you have these people who are kind of the forefront, some of the big leaders still, and there's not just Mark, many who are still platformed, even though they have a trail of bodies behind them, and it's well documented. They're not; these people aren't lying. So I think that would be the difference: is that I would offer solutions, but I don't think people in some of these circles want to hear my solutions, because ultimately, what I'm saying is, I think that this thing that we're doing, this mega church model, that's kind of new in our church history, in this specific context, it's not looking too healthy. I mean, the fruit isn't that great overall, from my perspective.
Yeah, and you hear that a lot right now, and man, so many thoughts come to mind. When COVID hit, right before COVID hit, I stood on stage, and I mean, truly, like before, like anybody was saying coronavirus or COVID, and I'm not trying to claim to be a prophet, like it was just God's kindness, coincidence, sovereignty. I'm not even sure. I said, hey, we may not be able to gather here very soon. Like that may happen where we can't gather here, and that's okay. Like this doesn't define us, and we can gather in homes and kind of, follow a home church model. And then lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. I mean, months later, we moved into the home church model. And so, but here's my thoughts on what you just said is I think it's an overstatement to say, in my humble opinion, that the mega church has to go. I would say we have, like, the unhealthy mega church has to go. Like where you see Jesus teach, thousands gathered, Jesus would have had a mega church. Like if he said, okay, these are my followers, and then when you see in the Acts of the Apostles, it says 4,000 were saved, 5,000 were saved. I mean, that was becoming a mega church. But it's how it's instituted, which this is where I think we agree. There are systematic problems within that church that they need to be accounted for. They need to be held accountable. They need to be fixed. And so, like, let me ask you a question. Do you think do you think it's in the realm of possibility for there to be a healthy megachurch? And as you consider your answer, then I would say, and if we did church exactly as you thought, right? You said, hey, this is what I think church should look like. And there was abuse, and there was brokenness, and there was, hidden sin and misogyny and all of the things. Would you say, well, then that system's broken too, and we need to reinvent it? So there's two questions.
So two things on that. I just want to say, number one, that I would disagree with the megachurch and Acts model. I think that's mapping on our cultural moment to a culture that had no context for a megachurch, PCO, Ableton-based system. Just because people get saved in mass doesn't mean that they're all part of the same church and with the same structure. But that's just my personal take on that.
I respect that.
Your question is really fair. And I think that people and maybe this is because me as a new evangelical, the creator, isn't always clear in our circles that what we are not saying is that, we have to find the perfect system. I mean, as long as humans do anything, it won't be perfect. I think that we all know that. I think we all agree. I'm certainly not perfect, et cetera. However, right, what we are asking is I'm asking for these large churches, right, and even small churches. This abuse is not megachurch specific. Okay, look at the IFB, for example. They are ripe with abuse, and they're not megachurches. But what I am asking is, can the leaders who taught me that the core of the gospel is repentance, right, and turning away from sin, and also realizing that if you make a mistake, while you are forgiven, there still might be, consequences from that mistake, right? Can we please have these people be held to the same standard that I've been taught to be held to? Like, again, I would agree with you, right, that yes, megachurch overall can be healthy if Mark Driscoll wasn't still a lead pastor of a megachurch. And also, while many people who are in those circles are very quiet about Mark Driscoll, they are not outspoken. They are not asking for his resignation. So I'm not asking for us to find the new perfect bulletproof system that is ultimately, the reconciled earth, in the future. What I am asking for is, can we please have what we've been taught as lay people happen to people in leadership? Can Mark please be forced to either step down or repent, and maybe understand that repentance does not mean, oh, great, Mark, back to megachurch pastor leadership you go, when your track record is clearly, clearly shows that even on a biblical level, you're not even qualified by by the standards of elder and pastoral, standards. So that's the difference for me, is I'm not asking for perfection. I'm just asking for being held to the same standard that I, or maybe you guys as volunteers, if you're volunteers, are held to for people who are in these positions of leadership.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Yeah. And I agree wholeheartedly. There's nothing there I disagree with. But let me ask a follow-up, because see if we do agree all the way. Do you think is it possible for Mark Driscoll to be restored to pastoral leadership?
So I'll put it like this. I mean, at this point, for Mark in particular, I would say not, at a minimum, not in the same capacity that he is now. Yeah. I used to work for Apple. Okay, I used to work in the retail store. I really enjoyed it. If I said an eighth of what Mark has been on camera saying to people, I'd be fired. Yeah. And even if I apologized and repented, they probably would say, we forgive you, but you can't work here anymore. Like, you've ruined it. You what you've said, even though you're forgiven, maybe the customer forgives me for calling her these things, there's still a consequence. I don't know how after, what's Mark been in the limelight for, maybe 15 out 20 years. After all of those things, I don't know how, even if he repents, how it would be even healthy for him to be back in the spotlight as authoritative pastor speaking on behalf of the scriptures and God. I just don't see it being healthy.
And so I think you're going to say this is different, and it is. I'm just curious. So, like, prior so prior to 20 years ago, like I was a really bad person. But is the way that you would define me, or most anyone, is the way I would define me. I mean, meaning I did a lot of bad things. I was a swindler. I was a cheat. I was greedy. I was manipulative. I was a sex addict. I was an alcoholic, drug user. Like that's what I was. And so but you would say it's okay that now, like I have a new life in Christ. I'm changed. I'm different. I've owned that. I've sought forgiveness where I can, where it was available. And that's I'm not disqualified from ministry for that. Is that true?
Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, that is the gift of repentance, right? Yeah. Repentance is a gift to make the wrongs that we commit as humans right. It's an image of the divine in reconciliation. Yeah. So I would absolutely agree, especially if I'm assuming you're open, you're transparent. People know this is no secret, right?
Yeah,
I've repented. I've made the wrongs right wherever I can, etc. Yeah. Right. And that's different than if tomorrow headlines come out that deep down, nothing's changed and you've been abusing people behind the scenes. Well, that's a different discussion that we have to have. You know, their context absolutely matters.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I mean, we agree. I think the only thing I would add is I think that's possible in the craziest of ways. And so if there is a pastor, I have a crazy story where a guy is a pastor of a church. This is a true story. He was the pastor of a church, and then he was there one Sunday, and he had a guest preacher that Sunday, and he trusted Christ, like became a regenerate believer on that Sunday when he's leading a church, And so that's crazy, and it kind of highlights the need for accountability and deeper questions in the interview process. But in anybody, like you could take your fallen pastor, there's a long list of them, unfortunately, and we could say that person may show up and say, man, those 20 years, I wasn't even a Christian. Like I wasn't operating under the Spirit of God. I was manipulative. I did a lot of terrible things. I said a lot of terrible things, and I'm genuinely repentant. And I'm not looking to lead a church tomorrow. In fact, I want to go into recovery. I want to go into reconciliation. I want to own all of the things that I've done. I want to take a long path, maybe because I was manipulative for 20 years, maybe for 20 years. I'm just going to stay in the desert where I seek to make amends with people. And should God restore me to ministry, I'm open to that, but I'm not fighting for that. I think there could be a really beautiful story in any and every situation there. And so that's the only thing that I would add to what you said, much of what I agreed with.
I mean, I think in the Bible, we see both of those examples, right? We see Moses being barred from the promised land, right? There was a serious consequence for what he did. But then we see Paul, who, I don't know, wrote most of the New Testament, who before he did that was killing Christians, right? So you really have a both and, where I think wisdom and discernment and making wise choices by partnering with God, right? This idea of partnering and using God's wisdom to be wise is so key here. So these aren't black and white, objective realities or not. Situations, context, looking at all the facts of a situation matter. And so I would agree with you. I think that certainly I've heard stories of people who were going one way, right? They repented, went the other way, and now they're just doing like things you're like, wow, like what an amazing story of the reconciliation nature of God that he gives to us through repentance to each other, and God. That's beautiful. So certainly wouldn't disagree with you on that.
Well, man, I love it. I've got a sick kiddo today, and my wife just called me 3 times in a row, so I'm going to have to jump off and just make sure everything is okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Man, I really appreciate the conversation, Tim, and this doesn't need to be a one and done. We're here, and thanks for, again, just graciously responding to that DM and honoring your word, and here we are.
My doors are always open. We live for good faith dialogue. I engage with people on in these perspectives all the time. I really enjoy it. My last encouragement and maybe food for thought would be, it seems like, again, I don't really know much about you at all, or even the team you're with, but it seems like you're a pastor of influence. And I think that the reality is most pastors want to do good. Okay. I don't think that there are pastors out there, that every pastor wants to manipulate and abuse, which for me, my encouragement to you would be, we need good pastors putting their reputation on the line and saying, no, we're not going to stand for these other pastors who are getting away with consistent abuse and are still platformed by other people as good pastors. We need good pastors like yourself to be able to take a stand and say, no, like they cannot abuse the office of pastoring. It's too important. So, I just want to encourage you in that. Like we people like myself who maybe aren't in evangelical spaces, I always look for videos of pastors who are just like trying to fight the good fight, who are trying to root out the abuse, who are trying to make things better. So, keep doing your thing, but we definitely need pastors out there doing that kind of work.
I receive that. I commit to you that I will, and I would just ask you and your listeners to pray for me, truly, and pray for courage and pray for boldness and pray for truth. There is and this is, I hesitate to say this out of concern that you'll hear it as a cop-out. For me, it's like, hey, I really want to understand what's happening there, and I've got to figure out whose word to take for it. And so the closer that I am to the situation, certainly the easier it is to do that. You can't sadly always trust the headlines, and I think you have a lot of people, not you specifically, there are a lot of people that are quick to be outraged by headlines. And that is not to say that real abuse doesn't happen. That's not to say that there are not real predators out there. And that's not to say that there aren't really people who are in positions of power who take advantage and manipulate. And I want you to hear me clearly say they need to be held accountable. And I believe the only thing necessary for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. And I'm committed to not doing nothing. When I'm aware, when I'm educated, when I see it. And when I do see it, I try to move closer to it, and I try to do my homework and understand what's going on. But I appreciate you, man. Again, please, the appeal there is to pray for me. And so I'm grateful for you. Thank you so much for the time and the conversation.
It was a pleasure. Talk to y'all later.
All right. Bye, buddy.
See ya.
Man, I just thought whatever I had to say was so profound. Like,
I was taking notes, bro. We just dropped some.
I was on fire, which I'm not surprised.
You guys abandoned me.
Dude, we couldn't get a word in.
Y'all left me there.
We could not get
abandoned.
a word in. You did fine.
It's because
I was just fascinated.
Y'all straight up just left me on an island.
No, you two both are like friendly debaters. You love it.
I know. I do. I really do like people like that. I love those conversations.
Space,
like I would love nothing more than just to like sit on a couch and spend the entire day together and talk through that. I sincerely enjoy it. Thank you guys. Y'all were gracious, truly. Like I know that's not fun just to watch a conversation, and yet it is fun because people do it every week with the Becoming Something.
We just listen to our own podcast, so it's fine.
Hey, we love you guys. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Becoming Something, where we promise to keep the conversation honest and real for young adults in their 20s and 30s. Every moment we live is training for a future moment, and that's why we do this podcast, because we want you to be prepared for everything that life is going to throw at you. Our hope with this podcast is that it would help you become all that God desires you to be. To find out more, visit becomingsomething.com.